You can't show up and be like, yeah, I like to work and I'm ready. I work to minimize this idea that there's a technical gap. Because when I look at people that are in companies right now, they're all learning brand new things that they didn't do last year. You can put career break, you can not include anything, and this is my preference if it's possible, you bundle up what you've done during that time as a job. We're good at our jobs, but finding a job is not necessarily a skill that we're all good at.
Welcome back to Talent Hunters, where we explore insights and trends shaping the global recruiting and staffing industry. Want to build talented teams that drive your company toward big goals and big growth? Then this podcast is for you. And now, let's join the conversation with today's episode of Talent Hunters, brought to you by HireQuest. Connect with us at hirequest.com.
My name is Vince Holt, and I'm the host of Talent Hunters. And today it's my pleasure to introduce you to Erika Price, founder and head coach at Root Cause Coaching, located in my hometown, Seattle, Washington.
There we go.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, Vince. I'm so excited to be here on your podcast and be on this side of the microphone.
Well, it's wonderful, and I'm looking forward to this. And I'm curious to start this thing out with Erika. You spent a tremendous amount of time of your career consulting in management.
Yes.
What inspired you to move into coaching professionals?
Sometimes these things just happen organically, and this is definitely the case. So my background, just to give you a little bit of a sense for your listeners, I spent more than a decade in tech. I was on the product and program management side, and I worked for companies like Intel and Microsoft. And then I took more than a decade off, and I took that time to raise my family. And so when I went back to work, my goal was to go back into tech. And from my perspective, I thought, I was still the same person that I was before. I had stayed up on technology and I'd be able to do that. And it was a much steeper climb than I anticipated. So I ended up in a different industry, and I started a podcast specifically for people that had taken a career break, because I felt like it wasn't something that we talked about enough. Like, how do you return from a career break? And what happened while I was doing that podcast was people would say, "Oh, are you a coach? Can you coach me?" And I was thinking, I'm just doing a podcast. I don't know. But so many people approached me to ask for coaching that I thought, okay, maybe the world is sending me a signal and this is what I'm supposed to do. So I did go get certified as a coach, and I started leaning into that. I kept working. I eventually made my way back to tech. I spent 4 more years at Microsoft. But that was the part of my job, and we can talk about what I did there if you want, but the part of my job that I loved the most was the coaching. And so eventually you just listen to the universe.
That's fascinating in my eyes, because you're right. Women starting a family, it doesn't make any difference about the gender, but mostly women who are starting a family take a leave of absence or whatever be the case, and they face a different challenge than just changing a job. Because in today's world of technology, things are progressing so doggone fast. It doesn't make any difference what you do. You're behind the curveball. So the first thing that I want to talk about, because in my profession, obviously, I facilitate interviews, introduce people, facilitate the interview, and help close the deals. But you bring up an interesting problem, and that is the gap. How do you address with your professionals? They discuss the gap. It can be 3 months, it could be 10 years. How do you propose to coach people to address that? Because it's going to come up in the interview.
It's absolutely going to come up. I think that there's a couple different ways, and it's so interesting when you talk about how long it is, 3 months or 10 years, because everybody that comes to me thinks they have a gap. They'll be like, it's been 4 months and I'm really worried about it. I was like, oh, you know what? I'm talking to people who have 7 years, so really don't worry about it. So in terms of how you address it, I think that it is a couple of different things. First of all, it's all about relationships, right? So you need to be in a relationship with somebody where you have the opportunity to explain it And that could be a recruiter, that could be the hiring manager, that could be somebody that's referring you to one of those sources, but so that it isn't just left to the resume and how it shows up on the resume, because in black and white, it can be harder. So that's my first thing, is make sure you're in a conversation about this. I will share that when I went back to Microsoft, my route back was as a contractor. And so, as you know, there's a lot of recruiters that focus on that contingent workforce. I chose a company that I wanted to go back to, and that was Microsoft. And I chose a consulting firm that specifically placed people there. And then I worked at building a relationship with them. They said, oh, you don't need to come in, just send us your resume. And I said, no, I'd like to come in. So I went in, I had an in-person meeting with the 3 recruiters that were there. And then I set my sights on contacting those people every single week. And so in building that relationship, I would send them an email every Monday morning. By this point, they understood what my gap was. And in terms of how I explained it, I packaged together the things that I did during that gap. So I started a podcast. I wrote 3 books. They weren't published. They were children's books, like middle grade and young adult, but it shows people that you did things. And then in addition to that, I had a tiny little marketing consulting firm. I don't have to say how many hours I worked or how much I was paid or that some of the work was for a friend. I was doing legitimate marketing consulting. And so for me, it's about name what you did, put it in a package that somebody can understand. And it didn't span the entire gap that I had, which was 13 years, but it put something there on the resume. And then just work on building that relationship so that you have an opportunity to explain to people what you did during that time.
So prior to you going out, you were a full-time employee.
Yes.
And when you came back, you chose to come back as a contract worker.
I wanted to come back as a full-time employee, but I couldn't get the interviews at the companies that I wanted. So I went back into a different industry. So I ended up going back running marketing and operations for a construction company. So for me, that was like a total pivot into a different industry. I went back full-time with them. And then I decided if I'm going to get back into tech, which is what I wanted, even that, yes, I was back full time. I could say I was chief marketing officer, chief operating officer for a small company, but that wasn't going to get you the interview that I was really aiming for. So I did go back contingent. And of course, the word full time is, FTE versus contract. You are full time in terms of how many hours you're working. But yes, I was contract. And then when I was contract, that just gives you such better insight into landing an FTE role, which I eventually did.
What I love is the attitude of let me show you what I can do. And I think so many people look at the negative being the gap, because a lot of people, we've had to address it in the last 5 years with COVID. It's caused a gap with people.
Yes.
Hiring has been difficult because companies want to hire perfection. And there's no such thing as perfection. And so you've got lots of people trying to get back into the work world, but we have our own hiccups. Well, I want to work from home. Well, I don't want to relocate. Well, and so we make up our own problems, walls, whatever. If you were to meet me, and I've been out for 3 to 5 years, what's the first thing you're going to say to me to get my head on straight?
I think it's building your strategy first. Like, what is it that you want to do? Do you want to go back and do the exact same thing that you were doing before? Like, and that may be what you're wanting. But it's to figure out what your strategy is. Like, if you are the job seeker, you need to make other people's jobs easy in terms of how they help you. Whether it is your friends that are at the company that you want to be at, whether it is a recruiter that's trying to find a place to put you, you can't show up and be like, yeah, I like to work and I'm ready. you have to help people. And so for me, it's about building the strategy. Like, what's that role that you want to get into? And in particular, I work to minimize this idea that there's a technical gap. Because when I look at people that are in companies right now, they're all learning brand new things that they didn't do last year. And so people want to maximize this gap and this technical gap that people have. But you know what? People weren't using AI a year ago in what they were doing either. And so I think it's important to realize, particularly in the fast moving industries, everybody has to learn new things all the time. You know, the people in those companies are getting new certifications and they're learning new software and all those things. And the skills that it really comes down to be successful, and I'm curious what you call them. Soft skills is a word for it. Power skills is what I like to call it. And when I was at Microsoft, I renamed this whole training that we had around soft skills. I renamed it to power skills. And the reason for that is because those are so important, right? The ability to negotiate, to storytell, to problem solve, all of those things, people that are coming with a gap, they have those in spades. Whatever it is you've been doing, whether you've been in the military or you've been raising kids or you have been, traveling the world, taking care of older parents, whatever those are, you've mastered those power skills while you're out. The technical skills, you can learn them. We can all learn them.
When should I recognize I need a coach to help me strategize?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'm biased on this because I'm going to say earlier than most people do, right? Because most people come with the problem. Like, I can't get a call back. I'm not landing any interviews. So I would say earlier than most people do. And the reality is the amount of money somebody's going to spend on a coach is going to be made up really quickly when you go back to work, right? So it's an insignificant amount of money if you're not working right now. To put it out there is big, right? To be able to spend money when you're not making money, that's definitely a thing. But the idea that most people have is that this is like inherent knowledge that we should know. Like, we should know how to do our resume and how to, reach out to people and send emails and pick up the phone. And, I think that most people can benefit from it.
Boy, you cover so much ground, and I'm I'm just baffled on some of this because you're right. It starts with a resume, but you talked about yourself not relying on the resume, being tenacious, wanting that face-to-face meeting. So, and this would help the recruiters listening to this too. Getting a return call from a hiring authority or a principal at a company is getting more and more difficult.
Right.
So how do I, as a recruiter or as a professional trying to make contact, how do I get this person to call me back?
Oh, $1 million question, isn't it? Right? Like, how do I get somebody to call me back? I mean, for me, I think the number one thing is to have that relationship established so that they do call you when it's time. They're not going to call you back every time, right? I mean, I know that, when I was working in the industry and I was super busy, I didn't call everybody back either. But it's being top of mind. So I mentioned, like, when I was working to land that role, I sent an email every Monday morning and to that particular talent group. And I worked to have something, and it's hard, but I worked to have something that would be of value to them. So it might be, you know what? I just happened to see that, these two companies like announced their merger this weekend. I'm wondering how that's impacting your business because I know that one of those is your client, or, whatever the case is. I might send them something that said, hey, I just wanted to let you know that I did this course last week. What is it that the recruiter can tell the hiring authority that will be helpful to them? And it's hard to think that way, right? But you don't want to be in that constantly selling mode, because they're not buying all the time.
So how does one address, I want to go back to this gap because I'm just dumbfounded by it. Because to your point, if you just send a resume and there's a gap in dates, I'm going to make a decision probably not to reach back out to you. So is there something that I can put in my resume that would explain bridging that gap?
Yeah, well, I think what you bring up is really important because it's that instant bias that you have. Like there's a gap and you've made an assumption about that gap. And I'm not sure what that assumption is, but if you look at, we talked about women in particular, 43% of women are going to have a gap. And that's here in the US. And while our, paid leave policies have improved at many companies, as a country, we're the only industrialized nation that doesn't have paid leave. So we've built a system that really makes it so that people will have a gap around that. So that's something important. Like I said, in terms of, just putting it on the resume, you can put career break. That's something you can put. I'm curious to know, though, what your take is on that as a recruiter versus, because there's a couple different ways you can do it, right? You can put career break. You can not include anything. Or, and this is my preference if it's possible, you bundle up what you've done during that time as a job. You make that be your consulting firm. And I'll tell you, the one time that I worked as a recruiter was when I was working for that construction company. And I would hire project managers and superintendents. And I will tell you, none of those people worked in 2008. And most of them had a company that was like, EP Construction. That was, of course, going to be my own company. And I was building out my bathroom at my house. Some of them left it blank because that was a recession and they weren't working. But most of the good ones found a way to say like, hey, I kept going. And I think that says a lot about your character. What it was that you were doing during that time. And like I said, for me, I bundled up, the little bit of marketing consulting I'd done, the books that I'd written. I'd done a blog on Medium and they'd given me an award for like aspiring writer or something. There's no money that comes with any of that. But when I went and had that interview for the contractor role, one of the first questions I was asked was like, oh, I see you have a podcast. How many downloads do you have? And they just wanted to know, like, was it a real thing? Like, can you come back into this work world? And you might have been working for your school or your church. You might have been volunteering for the Red Cross, all those different things. But like, what is it that you can put into that package to show what you've done during that time?
I love that. And look, I'm an old guy, so I address women leaving and having that gap to raise families. Hey, if I read on a resume, raised my family for the last 10 years, there is no stronger, tougher human being on the planet than a mother. Now, that is a transition that is taking place today because there's a lot of stay-at-home dads that are coming into the world today more and more all the time. So I can see taking time to raise my family. I buy into that because that's a lot tougher job than where you might go 8 to 5 every day.
Yeah. And LinkedIn allows it to be a choice now. Like you can choose career break on LinkedIn now.
Yeah. Now explain career break, because as an old person, right, I need more than career break, because did I just cut away?
Yeah, well, that's where I think it absolutely has to have words.
Okay.
It needs to have words. So just as you put, that I worked for, EP Consulting for these 3 years or whatever, if you're going to choose career break, you need to say, stepped away to raise my family. You need to say what it was.
Something else you brought up that it didn't really grab me until you mentioned it, okay? But somebody pursuing to come back to work. to voluntarily say, bring me on as contract. Let me prove to you what I can do. That speaks volumes to me about their confidence and their ability or desire to show you I'm up to it. And you mentioned that. You also, you're a little bit out of the ordinary because you took your time off to raise your family, but you continued to stay busy beyond the family. And that's something that people that are wanting to take a break could probably use a coach because it's their choice, probably could use a coach with your background at the beginning while they're going through that thought process. Mm-hmm. I like that a lot. I really do, because raising a family is a choice, most cases. And knowing what's involved with that. I have a banker lady that I deal with constantly, and she's about to have her second child. She's going to be out for 4 months. So she could use, okay, what should you, now she's tied in with the bank. And so she's going to continue to stay in touch and probably come in periodically and stuff to staff. But I like what you did. And that's great advice for somebody that's looking to transition. Yeah. When you come out of COVID, and we're still struggling with this, we've got a tremendous amount of people that are unemployed today that went through mass layoffs, no fault of their own. Some are going back to work, but there's a tremendous amount of people out there. What advice would you give them? And it's a blanket piece of advice, I get it. But what advice would you give them to catch the attention, because they don't have relationships for the most part? What advice would you give them to catch the attention of somebody, a principal where they want to go to work?
Yeah. I mean, for me, first of all, I fully acknowledge that those people are out there, because you will have people talk about the unemployment rate and how low it is and how there isn't a jobs problem out there. But try telling that to somebody who's been looking for more than a year, that there's not a jobs problem. Try telling it to somebody who, has heard that there's 2 million people in marketing looking for jobs. Like, there's a problem if that's where you are. In terms of, you're saying they don't have relationships, and I would challenge that. I believe, first of all, I'm a huge believer in LinkedIn. I have gotten jobs directly through LinkedIn. I believe everything on LinkedIn is a warm connection. You're reaching out to somebody because you have something in common. It might be that you went to the same college. It might be that 10 years ago you worked for the same company. It might be that you have somebody in common. But there's a reason, if you're going to send a message, that you actually do have something in common. And so I encourage people to lean into that as much as possible. But I think a ton of the work that I do on coaching is around mindset, because we can get really in our heads that I'm going to send a message to Vince and be like, hey, Vince, I met you. It was a long time ago. It was 10 years ago. It was at a motorcycle race, and you probably don't remember me. But people can get in their head and be like, you know what? That's super cringy. I don't want to do that. And you know what? If you choose not to respond to that message, you're never going to think about it again. You're not going to remember the name of that person. You're probably never going to meet that person. And so I work with people on, how do you start from a place of confidence and courage being, doing things that you're not used to doing things that you're not good at, right? Because we're good at our jobs. But finding a job is not necessarily a skill that we're all good at. But, how do you find that courage? And, I'll be honest, I'm a big believer in mindfulness as well, in terms of, getting your mindset, because you can't white knuckle your way through the job search. Like, you need enough resilience in today's market that you need some other tools.
How profound. When I was a teenager, my father told me, best way to get a job is go plant yourself on their doorstep of where you want to work, and don't leave. And the only way they can get you to leave is by hiring you. And that was the tenacity you talk mindset. That's exactly the way that I was raised. And if you want it bad enough, you got to find a way to get your foot in the door.
Well, and that's why I went the contingent workforce route. That's why I became a contractor, because then I moved into the house that I wanted to be employed in. Do you know how many people you meet when you're there? You're meeting hundreds of people. You're friending them on LinkedIn. You're in meetings with them. You get to know what's on the inside. And I did not convert to a full-time position in the same role I was in. My manager asked for the budget for that, and he was turned down twice for that. And so I was like, it's never going to happen. I just went and looked elsewhere. And then I had really good referrals because I had a lot of friends in that group.
You know, you just demonstrated exactly what you're preaching. And that is, we didn't talk about my motorcycle racing, but you brought it up just in a passing statement. And it immediately caught my attention, distracted me. And so your advice of do your homework on the principal, the hiring authority, whether you've met them or not, you can find some commonality. I mean, you could have said the same thing. You know, your beliefs, Vince, on Mark Cuban would have caught my attention. And so you're right. If people would simply do the homework to make the impression, not to try and say, oh, I'm best buddies with a Mark Cuban or something like that, or, you know, gosh, I used to race motorcycles too, or something. No, it's just, it's a subtle little passing statement. I love that.
Right. And notice I didn't say that I used to race motorcycles because I didn't. I'm not going to be able to have that conversation with you. But I could have also said, you know, we're both from Washington. And you started out the conversation that way. You really do have something in common. And it could just be that, you know, you want to work at that company. They're already there, but you want to go beyond it, right? You want to find, I mean, I have a client who went to MIT. And she finds that her MIT alumni directory is even more valuable than LinkedIn, you know, because they're there to help each other.
And you just hit something again from the standpoint, if I want to go to work for XYZ company, like you wanted to go back to Microsoft, there has to be a commonality that you're going to mold yourself to fit to get back in the door. And again, do the homework of where you're going. Whether it's with the hiring authority, with the company itself, what's causing the company to grow today? How can you adapt your background, your experience and everything to be of value to how that company is growing today? But it takes a lot of work on my part to be able to find that out as a person trying to go to work there. Profound.
Right. And I think some of it also is like showing up as your authentic best self. So for me, I had a weird incident when I applied for that job, when I did get hired as an FTE. The instruction, they had a webinar. They said this was kind of unusual. They did a webinar for internal and external candidates. They said, we have 3 positions open and we want to tell you about them. Go ahead and follow these instructions, you know, send us an email and tell us these things. And I decided, you know what, I'm just going to go all in. I'm going to tell them that I have a podcast. I'm going to tell them that I coach on the side. And I was applying to be the head of onboarding for one of our sales teams. So specifically cybersecurity sales. Actually, I don't think I knew the cybersecurity part at the time. So it was head of onboarding. You know, it was mid-COVID. You know, we were bringing in tens of thousands of new employees. And, you know, we had a year-long onboarding program. So I explained that I was a coach and that I was a podcast. I did not just match that job description. I went well beyond into what was very much me. And it's possible they wouldn't have liked it. But there was a little glitch that happened. The hiring manager sent an email, she thought, to somebody else. to say what she thought about me as a candidate, but she accidentally sent it to me. And she said, look at that, a podcast and a coach. I love it. Bring her in. And then that email disappeared. Like, I saw that email for 5 seconds and then it got sucked out of my inbox. But what that told me was keep leaning in on that. And like I said, if it wasn't the right place for me, they would have been like, yeah, no, we wanted somebody more technical, or we wanted, something else. But I figured out that, yeah, that's what they wanted.
Erika, somehow you need to get exposed to these people that are wanting and needing employment. How can these people get in touch with you?
They can go to my website, rootcausecoaching.com, and they can book an appointment directly there with me, because I think that the best way to decide if I'm going to be a good fit for someone is for us to have that conversation. So it is as simple as that. Go to rootcausecoaching.com, sign up for a career strategy assessment, and we'll figure it out. So I coach people individually and I coach people in groups. And I'll tell you, Vince, the reason that I started group coaching, I just started it this year, is because so many of my clients would say to me, I'm the only one that's not getting interviews. I'm the only one that wakes up to 3 rejections. And I would tell them over and over, you're not the only one. That's absolutely not true. But having them in a cohort together where they can really feel that, like, we're in this together. They build off of each other. I mean, they help each other network. It's fabulous. That's like an added bonus that I wasn't even expecting. People be like, oh, you know what? I know somebody at that bank. And since you're looking for a job in finance, I could connect you. Okay. So that's an even bigger bonus. But just having people be in community. You have your friends and your family, but quite frankly, they have a lot of bias related to you being out of work. Your family in particular. They want to be supportive, but they don't always know the right thing to say. And a lot of people are like, yeah, but I mean, are you trying hard enough? It seems like it should be easier than this. Being around people that are going through the same thing, and then I'm the guide. I'm there to knock down any obstacles that come up. Bring up the obstacle. If you don't know how to find your way to somebody, you can't get a connection. Or like last week, I had a person who said, I have to do a one-way interview and I don't know what that is. And I'm super stressed out, an interview with a computer system. And so we coached them through that. And it was fascinating for everybody to hear, your first interview may not be with a recruiter, a live person, it might be something else.
That's a scary thought and a whole different subject.
Yeah, exactly. We could have an entirely different one. But what I did tell them is that it has started, from my perspective, I don't know if it started here, but I have heard it most from new college hires. New college hires are used to that one-way interview process, and it seems to be dipping now towards more of the mid-career professionals. And it's a different skill set, right? When you're told, like, you're going to get a question, you have 60 seconds to think about the answer and then press go.
I just can't imagine that. I really can't.
But well, you could get coached around it.
Yeah, well, maybe. I've got to thank you so much. Your passion, your positive attitude is so refreshing that it's needed by these people that are considering transitioning from whatever they're at today to wherever they want to go. Thank you for taking the time today and spending it with us.
Absolutely. And I want to say one thing for people that are out there thinking they have a gap and it's 4 months. Like you mentioned something about people who, are taking leave for 4 months and having a baby. Like that doesn't even count. That's like a blip. So don't think that I'm saying like you have to go out and do all these projects while you're, on leave with your baby. Absolutely not. We're talking longer here. If it's short, whether that's a layoff or, a medical leave or whatever, I think those are just blips.
Right on. Thank you again, Erika.
Thank you, Vince. It's been great.